Good evening. You are in the combat zone. I'm Joe, and he's Nick. And, now I see I got thrown off again.
Welcome to the combat zone, folks, where the enemy only has three things to say: abandon ship, bail out, and take cover.
It's too much, Nick. It's too much.
For some of us.
We had a 1.5 day heat wave. It went up to 28 or 29 degrees today here in Ottawa, and I think I saw on the Weather Network a heat advisory. You know, our first heat event of the year, or second, or something like that. Oh, did I tell you that a couple of weeks ago I was noticing on my whatever it is, the MSN news site? You know, sometimes when you start up your computer and you go to your browser and it's preset in there.
Yeah.
And I like to scan sort of the headlines in it. And one headline jumped out at me in particular about a week or so, 10 days ago. And that was that climatologists were predicting that it would be a warm summer. And I'm thinking, I wish.
Yeah, when does that start? You know, it's funny because when you were talking about that, I spend my days driving around the city with what I do now. And I was in the car, I had the window down, and I'm listening to terrestrial radio, and they're going, oh, it's hot. Oh, it's going to be sticky. Oh, it's hot. And I'm thinking, it's not even 85 degrees out. What are you talking about hot? I mean, look, when it's 97 and you're dripping with sweat, okay, that's hot. For Eastern Ontario, that's hot. But it wasn't even close. I didn't even need the air conditioning. And these guys are going on like they're in a blast furnace. Like we are so...
Now, you know, you're raising...
What a bunch of wussies.
Well, you're snowflakes.
Yeah, exactly.
You wish they were snowflakes because they'd melt.
At least they quit talking.
Well, they'd melt, right?
That's the point.
It's actually very interesting because I do recall a few years ago, well, it's more than a few years ago now, not excessively so, but when my children were younger, and I liked to stop, when I was taking them to school, I liked to stop and pick up at a local coffee shop, a coffee.
Right.
A friend of mine owned one of the local shops here. So I'd stop and pick up a coffee. And one morning, as I'm coming through picking up my coffee, he says to me, what are you doing with your kids? And I said, well, you know, I'm just taking them to school. Because he wanted to know what I was doing with the kids today.
Right.
So he told me, he said, and this was in June. He said, well, haven't you heard that the schools are closed? I said, what do you mean they're closed? And they said, yeah, because it's too hot. And I thought he was joking, actually. I said, you know, you're pulling at my leg. Of course they don't close the schools around here because it's too hot. You know, quite frankly, growing up, they didn't actually even close the schools. They never once, when I was growing up, closed the school because it was too cold or because of the snow. What they would do is they would cancel bus service.
Yes.
But the schools remained open.
That's right.
And I, unfortunately, you know, through my high school years, even though I legitimately had to walk a long way, so that's not just one of those.
I'm not going there. Everybody knows that
one of those stories, you know, I had to walk 10 miles uphill both directions
ways.
Barefoot.
That's right, in a raging blizzard.
No, we had maybe a little more than a mile, and for you metric freaks out there, that's a little more than 1.6 kilometers.
It's a mile is what it is.
Yeah, we were sort of on the edge of the distance that before we get bus service. And, of course, this was out in the country, right? So, yeah, but the school was... So because I had to walk, school was never closed for me, no matter how bad the weather was. And you know what? When we go, teachers would show up. Not a lot of them. A lot of them would take the day off because it was hard for them to drive in from wherever they were driving. You know, some of the guys had to drive in 30 or 40 miles to get to the school.
That's fair. Yeah, but under those circumstances, okay, fine. I mean, I remember in 1977 we had a blizzard in southern Ontario where I grew up, and I happened to be in the hospital with a broken arm that had to be surgically repaired. And for 3 days, nobody showed up. All I could see was swirling snow outside my window. No visitors, nothing, and nobody bothered to tell me why. And that was the same blizzard. My dad, who, amongst other things, was a school bus driver, had 40 kids in a bus Now, if you've ever been to southern Ontario, down around Essex and Leamington and Windsor and Bell River and Comber and those places, it's as flat as this table. So when the wind gets going and it picks up snow, it carries it for miles. And if it hits anything along the way, it'll drift. And I mean, you can get some pretty, and it packs down hard because the snow's wet. And he was out on those roads with a school full of over 40 kids. And this is in long before we had internet, long before we had, heck, some people still had, won't say crank phones, but dial phones and touch, push button phones were the rage of the day. So the only way to get a hold of anybody was somebody had to be home when the phone rang.
I never had a push button phone.
You never had a push button phone?
Never had a push button. And in fact, we used to have a party line when we first...
Yeah, I remember party lines. That's kind of foggy, but I do remember them. And I remember my mother talking to a friend of hers, joking, say, okay, do we want to make a phone call about this and let the whole place know? Or do we want to just go over there and have a conversation?
Well, they'd all know only if they were listening in.
Yeah, but believe me, it was a habit because everybody heard the phone ring.
For me,
everybody heard the phone ring. So the question is, how many picked up? And they wouldn't say.
That's
anything.
A concept that is so foreign to people now.
Yeah, I know they don't get it.
Can you just imagine, like, if we had party lines now?
Oh my God!
And how people would be freaking out because Bell, of course, was the only supplier of phones at that
time. Yeah,
they had a monopoly, as you recall, Nick. And can you imagine the outrage today if Bell was still providing party lines?
Oh my!
Now
God.
I know that technology's moved way beyond that now, but in terms of privacy, etc.
Oh well.
It's amazing how we survived.
Well, the people just got used to the fact that you could have a regular conversation. Don't forget to bring home bread and milk over the phone, right? And you could always tell, you had an idea how many people were listening because the signal got weaker people that got on because you split it up amongst more phones. So if mom was talking to dad calling from, let's say, Leamington, honey, is there anything I need to bring home, before I leave town? Yeah, grab some eggs and milk. Well, we didn't need that stuff, but little bits and pieces.
Well, you
had to pick up.
You had your own eggs and milk on the farm.
That's
right?
why I said we didn't need to pick that stuff up. But generally, if there's anything, little bits of hardware, whatever, don't forget the fill in the blank, right? And if she had to almost yell, then she knew everybody on the party line was listening.
Right.
And most people, once they got the sense of what the conversation would hang up and the signal strength would regain again. But to get back to this thing about Dad, he was in the middle of this blizzard. Nobody knew where he was, and he ended up in a little town called St. Joachim. And St. Joachim had the parish had a school, and he had those 40 kids in the gymnasium. And he walked over to a little corner store, and they gave him a box full of chocolate bars because that's all they had. They were just a little convenience store. They weren't a grocery store, and they were there for 2 days. And they had skidoos out looking for him, everything, trying to find him. And because there was no other way to communicate. Skidoos, yeah, they were out on skidoos.
Snow machines, but for those of you from Alaska.
The reason I mention it is because we've gone from that, and I'm not suggesting safety is not important. Don't get me wrong. Okay, like sometimes you get into fog days. You know what? If you delayed the buses for a couple hours until the fog burns off, that would make more sense to me. But they cancel the buses because they don't want to run in anything solid in a bus full of kids. I get that. But somehow we've lost something, and that is all about, what are we willing to, what excuse are we willing to use to avoid doing something, whether it's going to work or going to school or whatever it is. Any excuse will do, whether it's too hot. Like how many times does the city open up cooling centers, right? And 40 years ago, it was just as hot as it is now.
Right.
Okay. There were no cooling centers. You opened your windows.
Right.
You went to the river. You went swimming in the river. But they did.
Well, we went swimming in the river.
Yeah.
But we were lucky too. We had a pool.
Okay. Or you'd go to the community would have a large communal pool. Okay.
Well, the communal pool around our place was our pool.
Okay, fine.
I remember. Now, it's funny because this was back before they made you put fences up for safety reasons, right?
Yeah.
And they had laws about fences. And in many places, they still don't have laws. If you drive outside of the city and you notice a lot of pools in backyards that you drive by out in the country, and there are no fences around them. So it's pretty safe. But in our case, the minute we put up a pool, people came from miles to be friends with us. It was really so. Eventually, my parents just got tired of it, and they said, we're going to fence this pool and send a signal. And not only did they fence the pool, but they ended up putting up bushes, and the bushes they put up were currant bushes, black currant bushes, and that was the start of our household wine industry. Because after that, my father loved to do all kinds of how do we put this? Not moonshine. There was no. We didn't distill anything, but he made a lot of different wines out of different things. Dandelion wine, potato wine. My father made potato wine that it was deadly. It was, I mean, seriously.
Now, I had a friend of mine give me some dandelion wine. He was big into making mead and different things like that. A little bit off the wall kind of, alcoholic beverages that rather than beer and the traditional wines. And he gave me some dandelion wine, and I took a sip of it, and you know what? It was bloody awful.
Yeah. Well, it's all of this stuff is not good. It's but my father made the currant wine he made was not bad. It wasn't bad, but he he never bought kits or anything for this.
He just made it out of the juice.
Well, no, I mean, we picked the currants.
That's what I mean. And then you crushed the currants, got the juice, made the wine.
Right. Well, but you could do that as well. But if you buy a kit and you check the temperatures and the acidity levels and all of that stuff.
Awesome.
But he never did any of that stuff, and it's still for whatever worked out. Now I'm sure that if I was trying it out today, I go, yeah, maybe the quality's not so good.
Yeah, your memory makes it taste better in your memory than it might have otherwise.
A little dandelion wine wasn't so good. The potato wine was awful, but I don't know what the alcohol content of that was, but it was pretty serious, deadly. Mead
Run a car on it.
We've tried mead.
I never did like mead.
No, it's too sweet. It's really a sweet thing.
Yeah, it was made from honey.
Yeah, so it's not. It's not so good. How do we get on the topic of alcoholic beverages?
We started talking about how much snowflakes people have become and drifted into alcohol.
Too. They really have. I mean, it's and just on a related topic, it was just occurring to me. We're not really technology is advancing really quickly today.
It is, yeah,
absolutely faster perhaps than ever, but the change is not so dramatic. When we, as we were talking about party lines, for instance. Mm-hmm. So we went from party lines and dial phones, to later on touch phones, of course,
right,
and single lines, and then only later on, in the mid whatever it was 90s, when they started with cell phones. And remember the first cell phones, how they were?
Oh my God, they were like 10 pounds.
The G.I. Joe things where you pulled that antenna out and, it was
actually
sort of
the first ones were mobile phones in cars.
Right, they did have mobile phones.
Do you remember Magnum PI?
I do remember
That's the first time I ever saw one.
Did he?
Yeah, he had a mobile phone in his Ferrari.
The first mobile phone, well, that wasn't his Ferrari, by the way.
Oh, of course not.
That was Higgins' Ferrari.
Yes, but I don't think Higgins ever had a license. All he ever did was fire that cannon.
Now I've lost my train of thought.
I hate when
Banachek.
Yeah.
Banachek was the first cell phone that I saw. Not cell phone, but car phone. I mean, it was a big
thing.
It was like a regular
almost like
phone,
a briefcase.
And you pick up the thing, and
yeah.
So for us, the level of technology that we've lived through, the advancement of technology has been, I think, far more profound than, even if the speed of advancement is much more rapid now today than it was 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. I think the change to our lifestyle is not as profound anymore. So, I mean, we went from, like I said, this, no cell phones and even no private lines where we were living anyway.
I remember 45 RPM records.
Sure, absolutely. Well,
now where are we?
Now that's the way we would get, because you would buy singles, right?
That's right. You buy singles and hope the B-side was half decent.
Yeah, it was because that was the way they sold.
That's right.
Music. You could get LPs, but they were called LPs, which stood for
long play,
because they cut these LPs with a lot of songs on. But the way you'd buy the newest songs was on a 45 single.
And you had to have that little device to go in the middle, because the turntable was designed for LPs, and they had this little adapter. Because for some reason, why they ever did this, I'll never know. But they would make the 45s with this 1-inch hole in the middle, and they'd make the LP with like a 1/4-inch hole in the middle.
Yeah, and it's funny because because we didn't just have 45s. We had
78s.
78s.
Made of clay.
Okay. And the 78s just had a small hole.
Yeah. So where'd the hole for the 45 come from?
That's a great question. And, okay. The number to call, by the way, guys, is it's area code 844-415-2115. That's toll-free anywhere in North America. And you know what? If you have an answer to that question, why was it that 45 speed records, and why was it 45? Because that was the RPM of the turntable.
That's right. 33 and a third was the LP. 45 was the single, and then the big old heavy thing. And I don't know if the ones that I know originally they made it of clay, but I think the later ones were made of some kind of polymer.
They were plastic, but you could break them. If you banged them, they would break.
Yeah,
and they were thick. They were heavy,
but they were
thick.
78s.
78s. You had to
so
turn
every turntable, and there was another one that we never had.
16 something.
16.
For the life of me, I never came across anything.
Neither did I.
We would put records on the 16 to play it slow and loud.
If your mother said something, when that record's over, you have to go to bed. You slide her over to 16.
Yeah. Robin Williams. So I saw a clip of Robin Williams in Good Morning Vietnam where he was playing a record, and it was accidentally when he was first trying it out, and it was.
I remember
very good. I couldn't imitate that kind of.
But
stuff.
You know what? That's one of the first the first record I ever bought. Was a Cat Stevens album called Cats in the Cradle.
Cat Stevens?
Yeah, that was the song that was on it. It was my first album.
To Islam.
Yes. And then I remember my uncle bought Cheech and Chong. And on that
Your uncle bought Cheech and Chong?
My uncle, who was an audiophile, he had, in 1978, he had a $5,000 stereo system. This thing was the best available stuff. And I would go to his place every Wednesday night getting ready to go to Air Cadets, and I would take... either Queen or Styx or Supertramp, and I'd take his massive speakers, turn them sideways, and lay between them to get the full audio effect. Okay, it was amazing. Anyway, Cheech and Chong on an album.
Up in Smoke?
Up in Smoke.
Okay.
Where they go, one guy lights that joint, and he spends 25 minutes coughing, and then he continues. He lights it and smokes it some more.
Right.
Exactly. It goes on and on.
Great stuff.
Yeah, great stuff, man. And then where's Fred or what's
Dave? It was Dave.
Dave. Dave's not here. I'm Dave. Let me in. The cops are after. Or going to the drive-in. Anyway, that's got nothing to do with any of the topics we had.
No, I know that,
but
it's still good. No, I didn't finish my question. If anyone knows why the old 45 discs had that big hole in the middle that you had to put an adapter into.
And we want you to call.
We want you to call.
BR549. No, wrong phone number. 844-415-2115 and enlighten the listening audience and us as well.
Yeah, this is a great question. And,
it is.
If we don't get an answer from someone out there tonight about this, then we'll have to Google it. Because Googling is, the
Well,
the
they don't call it Google you for nothing.
Okay, and by the way, Nick, if people are listening on the website, thecombatzone.ca, through the live player, if you look at that player, you'll see a little balloon, like a cartoon commentary section, where we put the comments of people who are speaking in cartoon. That little bubble, if you click on that little bubble, it'll open up a whole chat room, and you can chat with us live here in the Combat Zone. So you don't have to, if you're going to be embarrassed and you're too nervous to call, send a message through the chat room, or if you're listening and you're on Facebook, I see Nick is reading some Facebook comments and he's smiling. So actually, somebody's calling him names.
I'm looking at the answer to the question.
Did someone give an answer on
Facebook?
No,
I Googled it.
Oh, he Googled it. Okay, no.
That way I know whether we're getting the right answer or not.
Yeah, because Google's always right.
Well, in this case, it seems to make sense, but I'm not going to tell anybody yet because.
So let's
get to the serious stuff.
No. I want to go back to before we get into this other stuff, Nick.
My glasses.
I want to talk a little bit about the rapidity or the changes that have occurred in technology over our lifetime. And Nick's just looking around. The glasses Gremlin have got his glasses.
You know why? They put them on my
there they are.
cap.
I'm looking right at them. They're on his head.
There we go.
I should have known.
There we are.
Okay, yeah, I can see them now. So anyway, so we talked about phones and cell phones.
Right.
Okay. And then remember how it used to be that you'd get letters in the mail.
Yeah, imagine that.
And if it was really important, they'd courier it to you.
I remember
Send it
that.
by actual live messenger. And they still do that in the city, okay? So not a problem. But email, of course, wasn't invented yet. There were computers, but nobody had computers. It was just a new thing in the
and
70s
those started
and the 80s.
actually,
in fact, when I took computer science in school in the 70s, mid-70s, we were still using the computer punch card. So you'd have to figure out how to do the code in that and the programming.
And punch
it
it all
would go
in.
into the punch card. And then they would have to, because to process it, they didn't have anything that was big enough to process it in school. So they'd have to send the cards off-site to be run through a proper computer or whatever it was. So I don't know.
Well, the first one I remember was a tape deck drive.
Tape decks, yeah. You still remember 8-tracks?
Oh, no, yeah, but what I'm talking about for computers, they had a cassette drive.
A cassette drive, I never used a cassette drive.
We played Dungeons and Dragons on that.
Oh, you see, you're already way ahead of me.
I'm talking to you
before games.
Hang on. All it was words, a few words, one sentence on a thing. You come to a hallway, there's a door, or in front of you or to your right. What do you do? And then you type in right or left or whatever.
Okay, fair enough.
Very, very basic.
Okay, now I've done this. I've asked my wife if she remembers this.
Yes.
I've asked other people, and nobody seems to remember this. But for a very short period of time, when they first started renting movies, okay, before VCRs, and there was Beta, of course, which I don't know whatever happened to Beta. It was around for a year or two or whatever. And,
the
which was
Laserdisc.
sort of the laser disc. No,
I remember those.
Was it laser?
I remember.
Now, I'm
those.
not talking about Blu-ray. That's a modern thing.
No. We're talking about a laser disc.
So you'd rent the movie, and it was like an LP.
About that size.
And you'd put the little cardboard covering. It would slide into the thing, and it was a big machine. And it would play. So that's amazing because nobody else I've spoken to remembers those. It was a very short period of time they had those.
Yeah, they only lasted for, let's say, a year, 2 years at the most.
Something like that.
And I remember them. We never had a player.
No, neither did we. What we would do is we would rent a player.
They were very expensive.
To rent?
To buy. That's that's part of the reason why they died.
Probably.
Yeah, because you have a laser in there, and a real
Plus,
laser.
you'd have to carry these.
Yeah, and they weigh like 40 pounds. But you want to talk about memories. Do you remember watching the 72 Summit series?
I do.
We watched it in the gym.
In school.
Yeah,
they said
on a great big black and white TV up
they used
on
to
a
have
stand.
On those big stands.
That's
like
right, with wheels on them.
On wheels on them, yeah.
And we all sat in the gym floor, and we watched Paul Henderson beat the Russians. It was more than Paul Henderson.
Well,
but
it was Didn't they tie the series in that game?
That was the one they won it on.
No, they won the game, but it was how many games was in that series?
There was 7? No. There was more than that.
I thought it was 8 games.
7? Was it? Now
our memories are okay. If anyone out there remembers that,
yeah, I won't Google that.
No. Well, you could Google it, but
I could, but
that way, if people are pulling, when people are not going to be pulling your leg. Yeah, Paul Henderson.
Yeah, it was. I remember who did it. And that was one dirty series. When you watch it, when you go back and watch it now.
Because it was the Canadians that were dirty.
Oh, I know. They broke, what's his name, one of the Russians' best players. Who was it? Went out with his hockey stick and broke the guy's ankle. Slashed him right across the ankle.
Sounds like Bobby Clark.
No, it was a Frenchman. And was it... I want to say Guy Lafleur, but that doesn't...
No, Lafleur...
it wouldn't... No.
Lafleur wouldn't have done it anyway.
That's what I mean.
And I'm trying to think if Guy Lafleur was in that series.
Because
it would have been earlier in his career.
True, but he was...
That sounds more like a Guy Lapointe kind of thing, or...
Yeah.
Because Guy Lapointe would have been in that series.
It was a Montreal Canadian that did it.
Yeah, it sounds like Gilbert Perron, maybe Savard. No, Savard was too keen a player.
Yeah, it was... I don't think it was one of the top-level players. This was, for lack of a better term, one of our goons.
Well, they were all doing... So that was...
in those days, yeah.
Was it in that series, Nick... or the next series where the Russian coach was so tired of the violence from Canadian players that he pulled they walked off the ice.
I remember that. I don't remember what series it was in.
Yeah, it was either that one or the next one. It was.
We're really dating ourselves. You know that, eh?
Well, I suppose. Listen, I keep on trying to get to this technology thing.
Okay, let's go back to that.
So that was me coughing in the background this time.
I'm innocent.
Yeah, Nick's innocent. So, the thing that I found out about technology is what amazed me the most, Nick, was the fact that it didn't make my life easier, because I was starting to work around the time with faxes and that, and all of a sudden everything started to happen so much faster.
Yeah.
Now, speed, I'm not against doing things faster, because you can accomplish so many more things in a more short period of time. But what bothers me is that all of a sudden you didn't have the kind of time that you had before to think about things.
Right.
So, before you'd get a letter or a phone call, you'd think about it, you'd get messages, you'd sit down, and it was civilized. Conducting business was civilized, much more civilized, and much more conscientious. Today, with emails and texting and instant messengers and all of the social media that people.
It's a much faster rhythm to it.
But it's I don't mind the speed. What I mind is the fact that people are not thinking about things anymore.
Let me take this in a bit of a different, not a different direction, but to expand on it. Even now, when you say that you're reading a book, half the time you're not reading it, you're listening to it on YouTube, like I'm doing with this book by Hazlitt. Okay, it's on economics. Economics Explained or something. I forget the title, but it's just
right.
Everybody should be either listen to or read that book. But in 20, 30 years ago, before the advent of the internet, when somebody said, I'm reading a book, they meant they took a book off the shelf, they opened it up, they sat down, and to carve time out of their day to actually go through the mechanics of reading. And I think what's happening is when you look at something like Facebook, okay, some of these, and I'm the worst one for this. I will get involved in a conversation that sometimes go on 230 or 40 posts. Part of it is I can't stand to let the other guy have the last word. It's just part of my mental makeup. Okay.
Yes, we've noticed.
Yeah, I didn't think it was much of a mystery, but at the same time, it's because the responses come so quickly that if this was somebody would post something, like think of a real message board, a cork board in the hallway, and somebody left a note on it. And you looked by and you looked at the note and you wanted to respond to it. You'd go away, you'd sit at a desk, and you'd actually think before you wrote it down and then took your post and put it up underneath his. This conversation would, be more civil. It would actually make a lot more sense because people wouldn't be so prone to react with a knee-jerk reaction to something you just said.
Right, which is exactly the point I'm making.
That's why I'm explaining it this way, is because we end up in constant knee-jerk reactions instead of saying, let's let the dust settle. Like, take the issue with this border crossing thing down in the States with these children. At first, Trump looks like an animal. I mean, he's just a barbarian for caging children and tearing them apart. Well, to find out, that's a law that Bill Clinton signed back in 1997. This is not new, and Trump isn't doing anything that everybody else has done and never received one word of criticism over. We in Canada are guilty of the same thing. Maybe not on the same scale, but the same thing.
Right.
So if we took that mentality, say, you know what, let's just slow things down. Maybe we'll just calm down and think before we actually write. Do a little actual physical book reading research. And then come back and say, well, back in 1977, here were the conditions, and this is why Bill Clinton signed it. And whether you like the conditions or not, the fact is that law has been in place now for over 30 years, and nobody said a word. So how come you're hanging the guy for it now?
I hear you. Nick, we're going to have to go for a break. Won't be very long, ladies and gentlemen. Sit tight or don't sit tight. Get up and stretch your legs and do whatever it is you have to do, and we'll be back in about 2 minutes.
You stay there right there. We'll be right back with more on the Combat Zone. Okay, welcome back to the Combat Zone, folks. One of us is Joseph, one of us is Nick, and I'll leave it up to you to figure out which one's which. And remember, this is the show where the enemy only has three things to say: bail out, abandon ship, and take cover. All right, we were kind of free associating in the last half hour, talking about a whole host of things. Mainly, though, the theme was going through the technological advances and the kind of impacts it's had on our lives. And we're still hoping somebody will call us to the answer about why the 45 RPM album record has such a large hole in it. It's almost 2 inches, compared to a 33 or a 78 that only had a quarter of an inch hole in it.
You know, they made a lot of those.
They made millions.
And it could just be as simple as saving money.
That's not the reason.
I'm sure it's not the reason.
It could be that easy, but it's not.
Okay.
I went and looked up the answer.
Okay. Right, Nick already has the answer.
Yeah, so I'm just waiting for somebody to call, and I can tell you whether you're right or not.
Okay, and if you don't want to call, you can send us a message.
Yeah, go to the chat box. Go to our chat room at the Combat Zone.
Yeah, go to thecombatzone.ca if you're listening in on the live player. And also, if you're listening in on the live player on Facebook, I don't know if the live player is actually embedded on Facebook or not, but the URL is thecombatzone.ca. And if you look at the player, you'll see there's a bubble, cartoon. I don't know what they call those. There's probably a technical name for it.
Well, it's you'll see the play button. Underneath the live button, you'll see a heart. Just to the right of that, you'll see this little talk bubble, and that's what you click on to open up the chat room.
A talk bubble.
That's
cartoon
bubble.
Talk bubble. Yeah, if you click on that, you'll go to a chat room,
and that way you can. I have that open right here. So if anybody makes any comments, rude or otherwise, I'll see them, and we can comment on those as well. So you've got some options there. At the end, we kind of touched on this whole border situation down in the States with what's going on. And Trump has signed, by the way, today, a bill ending the separation of children from their families. So we've kind of touched on that, but where I think I want to go next is because it kind of segues in. It's an international story.
Right.
And it's about this International Refugee Day. Now, Joseph and I had a bit of a conversation about this before the show because to me, I think logically it makes sense that you're a refugee fleeing war, famine, pestilence, some kind of disaster within the borders of your own country. And let's say if you're in Algiers and a civil war breaks out.
Algeria.
Algiers is a city.
Right. You got
it. Okay.
You knew that.
I did. And I should have said Algeria because guess where
That's
Algeria
okay.
is.
I shouldn't have corrected you.
No, you should have. Glad you did.
Okay.
Anyway.
I'll do it from now on.
I'm never going to get a word in edgewise. Anyway, so if you
You're just
leave,
lucky Russ is not here.
If you leave the city of Algiers in a boat and you end up in Turin, Italy, once you land there, you're no longer a refugee. That's my understanding. Now, that isn't necessarily exactly the way the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, the UNHCR, which Trump has just pulled the United States out of, which is some of the best news I've heard all day. I have no use for the UN.
Okay, so he pulled out the
they criticize him for
the human rights.
Yeah, they criticize him for human rights crimes or some darn thing.
So it wasn't the refugee committee. It was
no. Well, he just got sick and tired of them criticizing the states and said, "I'm out of here."
Right. Well, and amongst other reasons, the country that's actually the most criticized in the High Commission for Human Rights or the Human Rights Council of the United Nations sits in Geneva is Israel.
No question.
It's always Israel.
Yep.
No
matter what it is.
Well, it's Venezuela gets on there. It's Israel. Iran for a while. I think Iran for a while was chairing the.
Yeah, I wonder why it was always Israel. Let me think. You could have penguins beating up on each other down in the Antarctic, and they would blame Israel.
Yeah, so it's encouraging that the Americans actually are taking these kinds of stands. And ironically, if I'm not mistaken, I think Israel actually has a seat on the Human Rights Council now, which is unheard of. That itself was a big change. But still, I mean, there were a number of issues for the and you're right. They were criticizing the Americans.
Yep.
But before we get on to refugees per se, I just think it's really worthwhile pointing out, if you haven't already, Nick, because I know we were talking about this before. I don't remember if you brought it up just before the break. But the reason that the president of the United States had to sign a bill that passed through Congress quickly in order to end the separation of children from their parents is because that was actually the law, and it was the law that was put in place under Bill Clinton.
Yeah, he had to repeal it.
They had to either repeal it or change it. So, when people say, "Oh, how it was terrible that that Donald Trump and the Republicans were doing this," in fact, they weren't doing anything more than enforcing a democratic law. I don't know whether they had been enforcing the law before. That's a different question altogether. But the law was written the way it was by the Democrats and signed into law by Bill Clinton. So now I understand that it's changed, and okay, good for them. But I think that you have to have a little bit of perspective, and this is something again with the speed at which people do. They don't think about things; they react. So somebody heard something, and the next thing you know, it's like they're putting these kids in concentration camps. Well, the reality is you're arresting the parents at the border for crossing the border illegally, so they're going to be in detention. So what do you do with the children? You have to do something with the children as well. So do you throw them into detention with the parents? Well, no. What people have been crying for, of course, is that you have to have some kind of facility that separates families and lets them live together, even though really the parents are breaking the law and they're under arrest. So it's a real dilemma. But that said, okay, I think again perspective is important. I'm not defending the policy because I don't have enough information about it to really be critical or not critical. But the one thing I do know is that whatever was being done with the children in terms of separating them from parents, these children were being properly cared for. And I would go out on a limb and say, my best guess is that whatever facility they were being put into temporarily while all of this stuff sorted itself out was probably a whole lot better than the living conditions
they came from
yep. that were compelling or impelling the parents to want to get into the United States in the first place. So, this is the problem with social media. It sounds like a great thing, but whatever you're doing, if you're on Facebook or you're on Twitter or you're whatever, and it's funny, because I said Twitter and I'm thinking, okay, well, this is advice that probably the President of the United States himself could heed, right?
Yeah.
Slow down, chill out, slow it down, hit the pause button, think about what you're doing and saying. Maybe Trump is thinking carefully about what he's saying on Twitter or what he's putting out on Twitter. I don't know.
Well, you should take a page out of Calvin Coolidge's book back in the beginning of the 20th century. And let's say somewhere between 1901 and 1910. I forget when it took place, but there was a crisis, and a whole bunch of people had been thrown out of work. So people started demanding the government do something. So he went in his office, he unplugged his telephone, and he stayed in there for 3 days. And he said, not my problem. The government's job is not to create jobs for the populace. That's the realm of private industry. And I think Mr. Trump would benefit from just cutting himself off. Take a week off. Drop your phone through a shredder. Stay the heck out of the news. Just sit in your office and do your work. And then, stay out of these kinds of things. That would be the way I'd counsel him anyway.
Yeah,
now,
but Donald Trump is Donald Trump. And
yeah, he's not going to listen.
Success. I mean, let's face it. He is the President of the United States. So awful lot of people voted for him.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And I don't know, what it'll look like after the midterms or what's coming up in 2 more years from now. Who knows? But
he'll still be the President of the United States.
Yes, but after that election.
After the midterms, he'll still be the president.
No, okay, but I know that, but I'm talking about when his term is up.
Right.
Will he be able to carry on for a second term?
I don't know, but this is democracy is messy, and for all of those people out there who don't like Donald Trump, first of all, I'm going to say I'm one of the people that I don't really like Donald Trump. Okay,
he's ham-handed. There's no doubt about it.
His personality grates against me.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of good things that he's doing. That he's not getting credit for and that he's not publicizing. And so I mean you have to give credit where it's due, it's his style, and you can't argue that the guy has his style. And look, if Hillary Clinton had been elected president of the United States, she'd have her style and her idiosyncrasies as well. So, again, just everybody needs to take a pill and chill out a little bit. You don't have to agree in order to settle down.
It's funny when you said just calm down, take a pill. Reminded me that pot's legal in October, and the whole country is going to just chill.
Yeah, well, unfortunately,
there's a whole bunch of headaches with that too. Maybe we'll get into that later. But I want to get back to this refugee.
Yeah,
idea.
Absolutely, I agree.
Yep. So, as I was saying before, with these situation with refugees, to me, when you find safe haven, it would make sense to me that you'd lose your refugee status, because what is a refugee? Okay, when you've found safe haven, the things you're now safe from the things that were causing you to flee in the first place. So
right.
That changes your status.
Well, it doesn't really change your status, Nick. Okay, first of all, from a legal point of view, it doesn't change your status. But what it does is the issue you're talking about, I think that you're touching on, is a real issue, and that is what should happen to people when they land in a country that's a safe country. So you have people who are landing in Europe, in Italy, for instance. Or a couple of years ago, there was a big problem with people who were crossing over into places like Albania, Hungary, Austria, those places. And these are actually safe countries. So when you land in a safe country, you're supposed to make a claim. You ask for asylum. And once you ask for asylum, according to international agreements, okay, because the whole process has been established by agreement between all of the different countries, okay? So it wasn't something that was imposed by the United Nations. The United Nations doesn't actually impose anything. What happens is people agree through treaties and agreements to abide by whatever the agreement is, and if the forum where that agreement was reached was in the United Nations, then that's where the agreement was reached. A lot of different agreements are not reached at the United Nations. Anyway, set that aside for a second. When you land in a safe country, you don't stop being a refugee, but you claim asylum. You ask for asylum, and once you ask for asylum, then the country that received you, there are a number of rights by international agreement that are supposed to accrue to you because of your claim of refugee status. And they have an obligation to process your claim. And so if people come to Canada and they walk off the plane or they cross over the border and they say, I am claiming asylum, or I'm asking for asylum, then we automatically make an assumption that their request is legitimate, and we put them into the pipeline, and there's an investigation, there's a hearing, etc. There's a refugee board. Their claim is adjudicated. If it's accepted that they are legitimate refugees, they then may stay here or go at their pleasure. Or if their claim is found to be fraudulent, that they're not legitimate refugees, then they would be deported. And this happens on a regular basis. So the real question is whether or not people who are coming from, insofar as Canada is concerned, I think, is whether people who are coming from the United States have a legitimate claim for asylum here in Canada. And that's a bigger question.
Yeah, I think
because the United States is a safe country.
See, to me, the answer is relatively straightforward. No, you can't, because the United States is a first world country. It has a functioning legal system with courts and all that sort of thing. You have access to health care. You have access to medical the things that you need as a refugee to get on your feet again. There's programs down there for them. You can't then turn around and say, okay, I've been here 6 months. I'm going to Canada because I'm from Guatemala, and Trump just said he's going to kick us all out, so I'm going to go claim refugee status now in Canada. That doesn't work.
Well, the people that affects are the people who are not the people who are actually not in the system. In other words, they haven't come to the United States from whatever country and made a claim and are in the process of being assessed whether they're legitimate refugees or not. Because if they were coming from some of these countries, they would be accepted. The problem for the Americans, and hence the problem for us in Canada, is that a lot of these people actually don't make a claim. They don't ask for asylum. They come into the country illegally. And by the way, I just want to point out that somebody who is asking for asylum, by definition, is entering the country illegally. But once you step off the plane or you step over the border or whatever, if you claim to be a refugee, if you ask for asylum, then you have to be processed based on whatever the certain international agreements that we've all signed. A lot of these people have entered the country, the United States, illegally, and they're not really refugees according to the internationally accepted definition of refugee. And so they never plug themselves into the system. They never make a claim. And now the Americans who have a legitimate problem here, they really do.
Yeah, absolutely.
They have a serious problem with illegal immigration. So they talk about being more strict in enforcing immigration laws and deporting people who are in the country illegally. So some of those people now are saying, well, we don't want to go back to El Salvador or Guatemala or wherever, where, they will live in abject poverty. I mean, real poverty. I'm not talking about,
those
Canadian
are third world
poverty.
countries.
So some of these people are coming over to Canada now. And by the way, not all of them are like that. Some of the people in Canada are just not legitimate refugees at all.
All of that is absolutely true, and that's why I'm just the dilemma is, to me at least, part of the answer is for them to get control of the southern border. If that means building the wall, then build it, get it done, because that will slow down the flow that are coming up from Central America. And there's nothing wrong. There is absolutely nothing wrong with a country deciding who can come in and who can't, for whatever reasons they choose. It could be that they don't like people who have one blue eye and one brown eye. It doesn't matter. It's their house. They get to decide who gets to come in, whether we like it or not. And that's as true for every sovereign nation, not just the United States. It's like when you have your own home, okay? You're not going to just let anybody walk up to the house and say, I'm coming in, you better make me a meal and give me a place to sleep tonight. I'm sorry, who the hell are you? And why should I do that?
Yeah, you make a good point, Nick. And the obviously, we Canadians should be, a little bit more respectful of American sovereignty and stop, lecturing them, etc. It's really unbecoming. We don't know the situation. We're not stuck in the United States, in some of the communities where this is a problem. And the problem isn't, bad people, etc. But there are real issues with respect to infrastructure, to planning, to, health services, social services, education. And you really have to get a handle on this. And right now, the Americans in some communities don't have a handle on it, and it's a serious problem. So, if I were the government, or if I were whomever, I would just again chill out, take a pill. I know I'm starting to sound a little bit like Cheech and Chong there, but easy does it, guys. Easy does it. The Americans, they're decent people. They're caring people. They don't need you and I to be beating up on them because we have some limited information about what their policies are, etc.
All right, that I think we've milked that cow to death.
I don't think so. I think that we could go on and on and on about refugees. Let me say something before we actually change the subject.
Okay.
Because we did talk about this off air, Nick, and I think it's worth pointing out. A couple of years ago, the German government, everybody was praising the German government for taking in somewhere in excess of 1 million asylum seekers, refugee claimants from neighboring countries like Austria, etc., and Hungary, although Hungary doesn't actually have a border with Germany. I don't think it does. I'm just picturing it right now in my mind.
My European geography is not quite that strong.
So they did, in fact, accept into the country somewhere over 1 million over the period of a year or so, refugee claimants from some of these countries. But what the untold story was that when these people came in, as is the case in Canada, when somebody comes and crosses the border and makes a refugee claim or an asylum claim, the law over there is that you have to process that claim. You have to adjudicate, investigate, decide whether or not, in fact, it's legitimate. Mm-hmm. And they did. And well over half of those claimants were actually deported, and they weren't deported back to their home country, whether that was Iraq or Syria or Turkey. They were deported back to the country that they came from before they went into Germany. So if you crossed the border from Austria and you were deported, even if your country of origin was Iraq or wherever, okay, right, they didn't deport you back to your country of origin. They deported you back to the safe country where you actually had an obligation.
Now, is it possible then for, let's say, we'll use Austria as your example, for Austria to say, okay, they didn't want you, we don't want you, now you're going back to Iraq? Well,
the Austrians would have an obligation to process those individuals if they make a claim themselves. So they went
one way through the pipeline, now they're going the other.
Right, and if their claim is found to not be legitimate, then they would be deported back to wherever they originated from. The fly in the ointment, if you will, if I could use that term, is what happens if the country that you're deporting people to don't accept these claimants back. It's easy to say, put those guys coming across the border from the United States on a bus and ship them back. But to do that, you actually have to put them on the bus and ship them back. And that means getting across the border, going back the other direction. I don't really know, and, again, maybe somebody out there can enlighten me. I'm not familiar with any cases where that's actually happened. It may have, and it may even happen on a regular basis. I'm just not aware of it one way or the other. Or it may not happen at all, or the government may have tried and the Americans might have said no and just turned them right back, just not let them come in. So you get into this sort of no man's land, this
Groundhog Day scenario.
A Groundhog Day scenario. There's a cultural reference. Yeah.
See, I watch movies too.
Yeah. So it's. But again, I on both sides of this argument, there are valid points, there are valid concerns, and what troubles me the most about the whole debate, whether it's this or that or the other thing, right, is that the people who are the most vocal about it, 99 times out of 100 don't have all of the facts, and that's on both sides of the equation. And it's just like an echo chamber. People just like to spout off on Facebook or whatever, and they love seeing their comments and generating reactions. And sometimes the most ignorant comments are the ones that generate the most ignorant responses. So it's not good. If there's one thing that I find today more than anything else, it's the general decay in the quality of public discourse. And politicians feed into that a little bit, but ultimately every single one of us have to look at ourselves in the mirror and ask ourselves, okay, are we really doing a good job just by throwing mud at everybody else? And I'm saying that as a conservative, because people on my side of the political spectrum are as guilty as everybody else is in doing this. It's not a liberal thing, and it's not a conservative thing. It's on both sides.
Yeah, and that you're right on that as well. I mean, when you get into this kind of reactionary comments, you don't leave space for people to be able to think slowly. As we've been talking about, it seemed to be the theme tonight. Not only talking slowly is one thing, thinking slowly is another. And to slow down and just actually let things digest. If you watch, and I know I mention him almost every show, but if you watch Jordan Peterson, when he's teaching, a lot of times he'll pause. And you can see what in his head turning, and he's thinking about what he's going to say next. If we develop that same mental discipline, Facebook will be a thing.
Okay, we're going to go to a break, Nick. We'll catch you guys on the other side in about 3 or so minutes.
Okay.
Welcome back to the Combat Zone. I'm Joseph. He's Nick in the background coughing. And this is hour 2. And
time sure flies when you're having fun.
Life, yeah. What was that? Life goes on? I didn't quite catch that, Nick.
I said time sure flies when you're having fun.
Time sure flies when you're having fun. Absolutely.
And does anybody have more fun than we are? I don't think so.
Okay. There it is. So, yeah, okay. So we've flogged the refugee thing to death, I think. Well, there's actually probably a lot more to say about it, but...
Oh, we can go on and do a whole show on it. But
yeah, I don't want to talk about refugees anymore, though. I want to talk a little bit about...
I want to take a refuge from refugees.
You want to take a refuge from... I want to be a refugee.
Listen, in some cases, they do better than we do.
Well, and it's unfortunate, of course, that the NDP won in Ontario. Good grief, that the Conservatives won in Ontario, because if the NDP won in Ontario, then you would have been getting it just as well as the
that's true.
As refugees.
They were ready to hand us everything.
Free healthcare, free dental care. Actually, I don't. In fairness, I don't know if refugees in Canada get refugee claimants get all of those benefits anymore. I think they do, but I'm not entirely sure.
Well,
Nick, I want to talk. I know we got a couple of other subjects, but I want to get into, for this segment, a little bit about the whole income inequality argument again, and because we've touched on that a little bit, but I don't think we've really drilled down as adequately into the problem with the arguments that are being made about how capitalism has failed. And the reason this has been on my mind is because I recently registered to get comments or to get postings from a new website for public comments. It's a blog, and people write these articles. It's not just 1 or 2 sentences or a paragraph, but they're actually essays. They're well thought through, if poorly researched and understood, arguments. And the name of the website, I don't know the URL, but the website is Medium, Medium, and it's a friend of ours actually that introduced this to me, because he's a pretty solid conservative himself. I won't mention his name on air, but he himself is a pretty solid conservative, and he's actually written 1 or 2 articles on politics and political philosophy.
Well, it won't take me long to figure out who it is, because we have a mighty short list of friends.
Yeah. Well, you do anyway, Nick. I'm pretty friendly. I've tried very hard over the years not to unnecessarily alienate people.
Well, I don't try to do it; it just happens.
Yeah. Well, some people are just good at it. And don't get me wrong, I'm good at it too. But anyway, so I came across a couple of essays this past week into my inbox on the disaster, the breakdown of American society, and the failure of capitalism, etc. And the theme that I keep coming back, or that these guys keep coming back to, is this whole notion of income inequality. Income inequality. The poor have so little and the rich have so much, and the gap between rich and poor has been growing over a period of time, and that's an indication of the unfairness of capitalism, and that we have to do something about that to do that. And again, you and I have talked about how that's really not an indication of anything. Income inequality why is that such a bad thing in principle? I mean, nobody has actually explained that to me. So, people ideologically might think it's a bad thing that they were poor and they were rich. And I'm not defending it. I'm just saying I don't know what we can actually do about that.
Well,
because the only way you can level off is you take from the rich and give to the poor. To use the Robin Hood phrase. But the problem with that, of course, is that you're actually taking from people who are better off, okay, because not everybody in our society is rich, but, on average, a certain segment of people have more than the rest of the people. So how do you level that off without doing injustice to the people who have more, usually as a result of, their own efforts?
Well, number one, you have to do it by violence. There are certainly those out there who are philanthropic, who are generous, who have a tremendous amount of wealth. And it's because they have the wealth, they can afford to be those things. Like, I got into a discussion one time with a guy, and he was complaining about how all these, these big corporations, the chief executive officers make all kinds of money. And I thought, first of all, it doesn't matter because it's a private corporation. It's not a crown corporation. But I asked him at one point, I said, have you ever tried to get a job from a guy making $25,000 a year? He said, no. And I said, do you know why that is? He said, well, and he hummed and hawed. I said, because a guy at $25,000 a year can barely feed himself, never mind provide for you an income. So you have to have wealthy people in society to employ the rest of us. Who do you think it is that gets into the investment capital, puts up factories, takes their own money, and, provides there's just so much wrong with that mindset.
Well, look, let's break it down, because there are a few important points that I wanted to cover, and you've touched on one of those points just right now, in terms of investment. And a couple of weeks ago, I was using the example of Bill Gates, and I'm just gonna summarize that in a few sentences, just to remind people, or if you didn't hear the discussion that Nick and I had at that time. And that is that, Bill Gates has a gazillion dollars.
Right.
Joseph Benamy, I don't consider myself poor, but I'm not on Bill Gates' level.
Bill Gates has got a gazillion and you don't.
And there are lots of people that have less than me as well. And so if we take a snapshot and we look at income or net worth at any particular point in time, there's this wide disparity. And I'm not going to dismiss that it exists, okay?
Yeah.
But in terms of standard of living, okay, and again, I'm just summarizing what we've already talked about. The standard of living between Bill Gates and Joseph Benamy, or between the super mega hyper rich in our society and the poor, and I'm speaking about modern capitalist industrial Western society. I'm not talking about the poor in Africa. There's no capitalist society in Africa. I'm talking about successful Western society, okay? The standard of living, the difference in the standard of living between poor and Bill Gates is really quite narrow, because Bill Gates might be able to afford 10 cars, okay?
Right.
And I may only be able to afford one car. But in the end, we still have cars, and Bill Gates can only drive one car at a time. And maybe he gets to employ somebody to drive the car for him. But I don't consider that to be a great leap in the standard of living. So we all have a roof over our heads, except for the homeless, but that's a separate issue altogether. That's right. That's not a rich versus poor issue. There are social issues involved in that, and quite often psychological issues that are involved in it. So we'll set aside the homeless for a moment, and we're just talking about the poor. The poor in this country have a decent roof over their heads. Mm-hmm. They have food on the table, not the fanciest food. They don't go out to the fancy restaurants, but, they go to McDonald's quite often.
A lot.
They've got quite often television. They have quite often
cell phones, microwaves.
Okay. So the standard of living, the difference between the lifestyle of a Bill Gates, the mega rich, and the poor in our society has actually never been smaller. The gap between rich and poor in standard of living has never been smaller. So we've talked about that before, and I just wanted to reiterate that.
Right.
But I want to delve more deeply into this thing about the difference between rich and poor and the idea of income inequality. And there are a couple of things that I need to point out. And now you've touched on one in a minute or so ago. And that was when you talked about investment.
Right.
When we talk about Bill Gates having a gazillion dollars, that's actually a Bill Gates net worth.
Right.
That doesn't mean that Bill Gates carries around a gazillion-dollar bill in his pocket that he can spend anywhere.
Right.
When we talk about net worth, and let's forget about Bill Gates right now, let's just talk about the average Joe or the average Nick. Our net worth is not just in the money that we have in the bank. In fact, in most cases, our net worth might be in our RSPs, which are not cash. No. Or they might be in the value, the equity in our homes or other investments that we might have. And in this respect, we are no different from Bill Gates. Our net worth may be smaller than Bill Gates, but it's important to understand that if Bill Gates has a net worth of $10 billion,
right,
$9,999,000,000 of those dollars of that net worth is actually in whatever he's invested in. And when he's invested in something, that means he might own the factory that's employing 10,000 people. He might have investments in that business that's employing 20,000 people.
Let's pretend for a second. Let's set that aside because that's obvious, okay?
Well, it's not obvious.
Okay.
I think it's important to understand it. That's not obvious. People think that the guy's got the money. And
well, it's not cash.
It's not cash. But that's money that's not just working for him. That's money that's actually working for all of the people that are working in those industries that he is invested in.
Yes, he's leveraging his money, and that creates more wealth in and of itself. But let's assume for the sake of this discussion that he is, and a lot of people would agree with this assessment, and I don't. But let's say that Bill Gates is the most selfish, greedy person on earth, and all he wants is a vault under his house filled with stacks of gold where he sits down there and counts coins all day. All right? And he decides that someone of his stature deserves a $100 million yacht. Now, that would seem excessive to most people. But what they don't think about is how many man days of work does building that yacht create? How many wages does that generate? How much tax revenue does that generate? Because we all can't do that. So if he goes out and he spends $100 million on this custom yacht, he buys his wife a $250,000 fur coat and $1 million gold ring, all these things, now you've created jobs for shipbuilders, for pipe fitters, to put the engines in and all this stuff, for the people who made the coat, for the people who made the ring. There's a whole ripple effect. You can't do things in a vacuum.
Right. So you're really expanding on what I'm talking about in terms of investment. What you're pointing out is that even when he goes out and just buys stuff, he consumes.
That's right.
Okay, he's a consumer. Like I said, maybe he has somebody driving his car around, okay?
Right.
But that's somebody that he's actually paying.
Or flying his airplane.
Okay, or somebody who's flying his airplane. And then
don't
somebody
do it for
had
free.
to build that airplane. And somebody has to service it. Okay, so you're absolutely right. We're completely on the same page with that. So it's just important for people to understand that money gets recycled. It's not like the guy sitting on a pile of gold, as you say, in a vault in his basement.
It's not
Although
Scrooge
in
McDuck.
principle, I'd be less than honest if I didn't say if it's his money and he's earned it, whether it's through his work or through his investments, and if he wanted to do that,
that's up to him.
God bless him, that's up to him.
Right.
I'm not going to start arguing that money should be confiscated because if you can confiscate Bill Gates' money, you can confiscate my money. Well, and I'm just not into that, giving the government the power to do that.
I think it was Reagan that said a government that's big enough to give you everything is also big enough to take everything.
Absolutely.
Now, the other thing about this kind of thing, I had a guy that I spar with on Facebook, who I won't mention Lou's name. Anyway, it's an inside joke. But he sent me a link to this talk show podcast kind of thing, similar to what we do, only it has video. The difference is this guy he's a communist. I mean, he's an absolute, and he was talking about the wealthiest man in the world and how many billions of dollars. And he said, look, he could solve homelessness and put an end to poverty and still have $100 billion left over. I thought, okay, let's follow that logic and see what happens. Because he thinks it's a one-time shot of money and the problem's solved. But homelessness and hunger and poverty, you don't solve once and for all. It's an ongoing problem. So let's say that if it took every penny he had, and he was altruistic, he said, I am sick and tired of seeing people suffer. I'm going to end it because I got the cash. And he injected that into the world, and all of a sudden, for one day, there's no poverty and there's no homelessness. What happens tomorrow? What are you going to do the day after that when somebody becomes homeless because of a fire burned them out, they lost a job, alcohol played a role, gambling, who knows, some addiction, some misfortune in life comes along and cost them not only their livelihood but cast them out on the street as well. Now what do? Where are you going to go to get the money? Because you just blew it all. And they never think it through. It's like the old saying about the Catholic Church. Well, if the Catholic Church sold all its wealth, all its paintings and all that, we could solve world hunger. No, we wouldn't. All we do is lose all these treasures that the church has into private collections where no one except the owners would ever see them and a few select people they like. The rest of us would go without, and you'd still have world hunger, and you'd still have poverty. These problems are not solved in one fell swoop. Otherwise, we'd have solved them decades ago.
Yeah. You make some very good points.
Very rare, but I do. On occasion.
It's not rare. I think another thing that I want to point out about income inequality is that, well, two other things. The first thing is that it's a snapshot.
Yes.
It's a snapshot. It's a snapshot of statistical categories. It's not a snapshot of people. Well, it is a snapshot of people, but the people's circumstances, the people who fit into those statistical categories, their circumstances are constantly changing. So the statistical category, poor versus rich, okay, that may be static. And it maybe it's not even static. Maybe the gap is growing between poor, however you define that, and rich, between the lowest level of income and the highest level of income. But remember, those are just statistical categories. What's important is whether or not the people who are in that statistical category at the moment that you take the snapshot are still in that statistical category a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. So really, you have to understand what's called income mobility. And the people who are at the bottom of the earning spectrum are typically people who are just entering the workforce.
Right.
It's their first job. They're getting paid minimum wage. Maybe they're flipping burgers at McDonald's. They're not making a lot of money.
They don't have a lot of skills.
But they're going to school. They're getting experience. They're getting an education. Or if they're not going to school and getting educated at school, which I, would say is probably, I won't say a rarity, but it's much more challenging and difficult today than it was at some point in time in the past. So, but they're getting training, they're getting skills, they're acquiring skills,
right.
Okay, whether it's at school or otherwise. And they're improving themselves, and they're settling in, they're building savings, okay? They're earning a little bit more money every year because they move from a part-time, temporary job while they're going to school into something a little bit more permanent. They climb the income ladder. So what really you have to look at is, where are the people who are in that lower category today? Where are they going to be 10 years from now? And typically, again, we're speaking averages here, but on average, the person who is in that low income bracket today will not be in that low income bracket 10 years from now.
Well,
so the category remains static. It remains down here.
Right.
Look at that. People are poor. But the people who are poor have actually worked their way up. And here's the other important thing, and I wish I had spent a little bit more time doing some research on this, because I know that there's data in order to back up what I'm saying, but the point I would make is, and this is critically important to understand, is that the people who are at the top of the income spectrum today, okay, in the upper bracket, aren't the same people 10 years from now.
That's the point I was going to make.
Because they fall down as well, or they remain static for whatever reason, and people pass over them.
Right.
And so, again, there's this, in a society like ours, a capitalist society with a relatively free market economy, the important thing is not where you are. The important thing is that there are no class barriers to you advancing, okay? And quite frankly, there are no ledges to prevent you from falling down, sinking down somewhat.
Okay. One of the things I wanted to mention about that is, and Ben Shapiro makes a great case about this. He talks about this specifically, about the fluidity built into the low income and the high income end. And the thing that I think is hard for a lot of people to understand, because they don't have a basic grounding in how they think they know how the economy works. And I've had more than one person try to school me on it. And I am no economic genius, or my bank account would look a lot better than it does. No arguing there, okay? I've made as many financial mistakes as the next guy. But I understand basic economics and how the economy works. And listening to this Hazlett guy has really opened my eyes to how the economy actually works and what happens when you do this. Here's the consequence, and people will make this argument. So it's been a real education. But what they don't seem to understand, the first thing is they think that money is finite, that there's only so much to go around, that if I have $1 more than you do, I must have taken it from you or somebody else, that there's no way to grow money, that it's a pie of a certain size, and the more people there are, the smaller the pie. And what they get mad at is when they see, because people who are socialists, they don't like the poor. They just hate the rich, is really a way to look at it. So when they see somebody who's driving, as an example, today I saw one of the first times in my life I've seen in the flesh a Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow. Okay, that's the mark of somebody who's got some real money. Okay, because those things are $500,000 a piece. And when I saw it, I thought, wow, a good-looking car. I didn't care how much I thought it was a beautiful car. They're one of the best-made cars on the planet. I don't own one. Why not? Because I don't have the funds necessary to buy it and maintain my lifestyle. Okay, I don't have enough for either, never mind and or. But the point I'm making is that they have this, they don't understand that the economy, wealth, money is like seeds you put in the ground. And if you invested in a business venture of your own money, and then you ask other people to come along and help you, then if it's a good idea and it has a good cost-benefit analysis and a business model, then banks and philanthropists and entrepreneurs will come along and they will buy into your idea and help you by putting their money in it too. But you got to have something to put into it as well. And in some cases, people don't want to do that, and they want the government to come along and give them grants, which means they want the government to take risks that the banks aren't willing to take. So they're willing to risk your money, they just don't want to risk their own. And when you try to challenge them on that, they get all defensive, because that means they actually have to get up and go out and sometimes have 2 or 3 jobs or make huge sacrifices they're just not prepared to make. And that's one of the challenges as conservatives that we have to get them to understand. If you want to get somewhere in life, you got to get up, you got to go out, and you got to do something.
Well, this is it. And, you have to put effort in, and there's no guarantee that you're going to be successful. But if you're not successful, you pick yourself up off the ground, you dust yourself off, and you get on to the next thing.
Right. You only fail when you quit trying.
Right. And, there's I think it's a great story of, I can't remember his first name, but whoever it was that invented Hershey chocolates.
Mr. Hershey.
Mr. Hershey. I don't remember his first name, but if you're ever in Hershey, Pennsylvania, where the Hershey factory, the world headquarters of Hershey is, you go on. They've built this town around the factory and around the Hershey legend, and it's really quite educational. And you go on a town tour in one of the little trolley cars, and it's kind of schmaltzy. You know, they get you, they give you these songbooks, and you know and the tour guide's all dressed up in old-fashioned clothes, and they get you to sing, you know, by the light of the silvery moon and all of this stuff. And so it's kind of fun, but it's kind of corny too.
It's
at the same
a little
time.
over the top, which is typically American.
But they talk about the Hershey story, and you know, here's a fellow that actually failed in 5 or 6 businesses before he succeeded.
Yep.
And look, I'm not underrating the challenge that's involved in that. I mean, people get beat up emotionally. It's not easy.
No.
Taking risks and falling down and failing. But that is how progress actually occurs.
You know something? I can't think of a single major company. Take Singer Sewing Machines, take Hershey's, take Ford's, you name the company. Not one of them started out as a multinational. They all started out with one individual who had a dream that he figured was worth working for because he wanted to make the life for his family better. And because of that, like when Edison invented the light bulb, he wasn't interested in lighting the world. He just wanted to find a way to make a little more money. And as a result, we all benefit because now we have light bulbs.
And with that, Nick, I think we're going to go into our third break, and trying to think of something witty to say here as we break for the third break here, going into the home stretch.
You stay right there. We'll be right back with more on the Combat Zone.
There's your wit for you. Welcome back to the Combat Zone. We're in the home stretch, the final 30 minutes, and I'm Joseph, and he's Nick, and we really got the names straightened out this week, Nick. It's a really big relief because
we were worried about who was who.
We had a couple of those problems there a couple of weeks ago about.
Well, you do something long enough, you'll get it figured out.
Yeah, absolutely. So, got a thing here from Mark on the chat room asking us if we're on tonight, and I'm a little surprised that we got that message from Mark, because obviously if you're in the chat room, the answer is that we are on.
Yeah, he just posted, there you are.
Oh, there we are. Yeah, you must have caught us during the break there, Mark.
Yeah, must have.
Okay, there we go. So we're back on. And, you know, I hijacked that last segment. We weren't actually going to talk about income inequality, etc. But, you know, I wanted to get into a couple of things about, you know, some, I guess you might call it conservative philosophy, but really it's not conservative. It's just, you know, common sense, the way the world really works.
I would say that one of the features of being a conservative is using common sense, logic, and reason. Because a lot of people get wrapped up in things emotionally and they stop thinking. And that's one of the reasons why groups like the NDP, parties like the NDP, want to lower the voting age, because they know that younger people tend to be more emotional. Okay,
now you see, you're baiting me, Nick.
Am I?
Because I wasn't even going to bring this up, but now that you've mentioned it, so one of the provisions that is before Parliament right now, there are 2 or 3 bills to reform the Elections Act, and one of them is to empower the Chief Electoral Officer to create a pre-voting list. In other words, if you're not a voter because you're not 18, that's fine, but we can create this list of voters who are not yet 18 years old. And the minute I saw that, alarm bells went off right away, and I'm saying, okay, that is the only reason for doing that, is to create a list that we can easily transform into a voters list if we lower the voting age. That's the only reason for doing that. So, but let's, Nick, I know that's not what you want to talk about. Let's save that for a future show.
Okay.
It's, you know, we don't want to do 3 hours because 3 hours you guys are going to get tired of listening to us. But believe me, we could do 3 or 4 hours virtually every night. There's so much material to talk about.
There's no shortage of it, that's for sure. And the one thing I want to get into.
Let's talk, because talking about common sense.
Yeah,
this is one of Nick's pet peeves.
You know, this is the kind of thing. What drives me crazy is when organizations, be they governments, sports teams, you name it, I don't care the organization, do things that make absolutely no sense. Now, in this case, I'm talking about municipalities. I'm going to use Ottawa as an example, but it's not restricted to Ottawa. I have enough miles behind me in a tractor trailer to tell you this happens in every major city in North America. For some reason, the city fathers cannot plan for construction season. Now, for those of you who are listening out of town, and maybe you have never been to Ottawa before, like every other major city, they have major 4-lane, 5, 6-lane highways that come and go out of the city. Okay? And in this case, if you're not familiar with the area, our version of that is the 417. It's one of the 400 series highways here in Ontario. And it parallels the river, runs right through town, and goes all the way down to Montreal.
Well, eventually it does go to Montreal.
Well, it carries on all the way. Then you pick up the 401, you hit the 20, you go all the way to the coast. But the point I'm making is, for our intents and purposes, it's the 417, and then you have the 416 that goes towards, so you've got two major roads. And you also have, what was supposed to be a ring road called Hunt Club Road that they never did turn into a ring road. They took too long to get it done. So what I'm talking about is, in the middle of town, in the middle of the city, and city's kind of right on the border of being a city. Ottawa's only really got about 300,000 people in it. So it's like London, Ontario is not a city, and it's about the same size from a population point of view. But everybody calls Ottawa a city because it's the nation's capital. So anyway, they have the 417, and there's an exit called Carling. And it's almost in the center of where the highway passes through the city. And they closed it for a month. All right, okay. That causes huge backups because a lot of people who would have gotten off on Carling, and even that exchange is a mess. How they ever came up with it, I have no idea. Now they have to find other alternatives. The lanes have been squeezed from 4 down to 3, so that backs traffic up. So a lot of people are looking for alternate routes because they still have to get to the office on time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I was one of those people. I was coming from the west out in a little place called Canada. On my way, I'd been out to the different sites I had to visit, and I was on my way downtown. As I'm coming into the city, I know this is up there, and I'm thinking, okay, I don't want to sit in traffic for half an hour, inching along, at 3 feet an hour. I just don't want to be there. So I thought I'll get off at an exit, run down to Baseline, which parallels the highway, run down there, and take the first major road past Carling. I'll take it back, get back on the highway, and I'll miss this whole mess. Everything was going fine. I got on Carling, or on Baseline, sorry. I turned onto, I think it's called Fisher, and went up there, and the traffic came to a screeching halt. What is going on? So I got up there. They're doing construction halfway up Fisher at a traffic light. They've got the road ripped up. There's one lane, and there's a traffic cop directing traffic through that intersection. So I'm thinking, all right, well, tomorrow I'll get off at another exit, and I'll go the other way towards the river because there's what's called the Parkway along the river. That's basically 4 lanes. There's 2 lanes into town, 2 lanes out. And I'll take Woodruff, and I'll pick it up there and run in that way and avoid this mess by going the other way. I get off on Woodruff. I get up there, all of a sudden traffic comes to a halt. Why? Construction I couldn't believe it. And over the last 3 days, every road I've tried, I've run into construction that is almost scientifically designed to add 45 minutes to my commute downtown. Now, I know this is a first world problem, and I know sound like a whiny little baby. But yeah, that's me. I'm sucking my thumb, and I'm mad as hell about it because this city and others like it seem to go out of their way to either ignore any kind of planning. Okay, because if you're a city father and you're looking at your planning department and they lay out what they want to do this year for repairs to the infrastructure, the roadways, Wouldn't it make sense? You say, okay, we're going to close down the major artery. We're going to take an exit away. That's going to have an impact on traffic. And at the same time, over on this major artery that people will use to get around that, we're going to do some construction there as well. And oh, by the way, we're going to do that on the other side of the highway. So no matter what they try, they're going to get stuck at traffic lights. Wouldn't it make sense for somebody to say, well, you know, if we did this job south of the highway before we close the exit, it would be done and out of the way. People could get off and not be impeded too much by this construction. So in other words, look at the plans and say, how can we mitigate this by juggling the schedule so that one major project isn't interfering with another? Wouldn't that be smart? Not in Ottawa, because that's not how they do things here.
Well, it's not just in Ottawa. It's everywhere. And you know, let's use this as an example of a principle with government, and that is the principle of inefficiency. And, you know, from a political perspective, there's a real danger in promising to cut taxes and cut spending simply by making government more efficient. Because the reality is that government is not efficient, and you have to simply accept that. So here's a great example, Nick, I like to use with people to demonstrate how government programs are fundamentally inefficient. Let's take two communities. One community of 1,000 families, the income for every single one of those 1,000 families is $25,000 a year. And then we have another community. And the other community, it's just down the road, also is 1,000 families. And the income for every single one of those 1,000 families is $75,000 a year. If I take those two communities and put them together, what's the average income?
$50,000.
$50,000 a year. How many families earn $50,000 a year?
None of them.
None of them do. So if I want to design a program that's targeted for families that earn $50,000 a year, because that's the only way I can do these things is through statistics and averages, etc. The program I'm designing actually doesn't help a single family. So if I want to help all of those families, I have to design a program that's going to help people whose incomes are somewhere between $25,000 a year and $75,000 a year. So now I have a very large catchment, okay? So it's a very simple, almost childish example of how things get calculated, okay?
But how hard is it, though, Joseph, to look at a freaking roadmap and say, if I close this exit, X, Y, Z is going to happen?
So I actually have an answer.
Please share it with me.
The answer is that the 417 highway that you've referred to, the main freeway, east-west freeway going through Ottawa, is owned, operated, and maintained by the provincial government. The other roads are municipal roads. So they may not even, it's two completely different levels of government. And I know Nick is gesticulating wildly.
I'm just saying, talk to each other.
Well, that's the thing is I didn't know whether he was just saying talk to each other or he was, about
having
to have
an epileptic fit,
seizure,
Well, look,
that's politically incorrect, Nick. Now we're going to get complaints about that.
Tough.
Now that's politically incorrect.
Tough. Anyway, in my line of work, okay, what I do now, I'm a site inspector for a real estate company, a commercial real estate company, and we have contractors that we work with every day. Some jobs are bigger than others. On the larger jobs, one of our goals is to have the designer, the engineer, and the mechanical engineer and all the different trades before we ever set foot on the site to overlay their plans. Now, it doesn't always happen, but that's the goal. And say, okay, what issues can we resolve? Like if I put my sprinkler system here, what about the air system, the HVAC system? Am I going to be able to get my trunking through there? And the guy with the lighting says, well, I won't have any room for my conduit, and then redesign it so everything fits. Sometimes we get lucky that way. But when it doesn't work, there's people on site who can make decisions about how these things are going to work together. And this is why the private sector is so much better than the government at doing anything.
Right. But again, in fairness, not defending government, but if you were on a larger project, some of the really large construction projects, you'd still have some of these coordination problems. But generally speaking, I agree with you. And, going back to what I said, this is an illustration of what doesn't work well with government. Government is so big and so cumbersome that it really defies creating or inducing some kind of real meaningful efficiency. And that's just one of the problems with government. And here's the thing I'm saying, Nick, is politically, there's a real danger in promising that you're going to cut spending and cut taxes through efficiencies in government.
Okay,
that's a problem.
Before we go where you're going with that, because it sounds like cap and trade talk to me, there is an example I want to use of how governments could do this and just make a world of difference. If you remember back, I believe the year was 1989, there was that major earthquake in California that collapsed all the freeways. It stopped the World Series. It just, pancaked highways. I remember them pulling people up from between the two multi-decked highways that had collapsed. And when they rebuilt it, they said as an incentive to the winning contractor who had won the contract, we will give you $100,000 a day for every day that you come in early. Two things happened. When it came time to move the massive H-beams to put them in place for the overpasses, they didn't have the technology we now have where you build the bridge and then put it in place. They had to be built on the site. So he couldn't get those H-beams down the highways fast enough. He built his own railway. On top of that, he came in 6 months early because there was an incentive in it for him to get the job done. Now, he still had quality control checks. There were mile marks, what do they call them now? Benchmarks he had to hit. There were quality control certifications he had to pass. He couldn't just slap something up, in other words. There was oversight. But he got it done 6 months faster than they anticipated.
Yeah, I don't dispute that.
No, I know. I'm telling you the story because I'm saying that what I'm saying is why in God's name don't we do the same thing here?
Well, you're still talking about two different levels of government.
Okay, well, oh man. It's like one hand not knowing what the other one's doing.
Exactly.
So get the two hands talking. I mean, how hard is it for the municipal planning office to call the provincial planning office and say, here's what we're going to do?
Okay, I get it, Nick. I'm not arguing the point with you, okay? There's no question that they could do it better. But even if they're doing it better, it's still only going to be mediocre. It's going to be better than bad, okay?
So
it's going to be the choice between, I always told my kids, okay, life is not about right and wrong. It's about having to choose between wrong and more wrong or between right and more right.
Having said that, though, I do remember, what is it with Liberals and bridges? I don't know. But it was in the fall. I think it was 2 years ago now. Kathleen Wynne was up in... not Timmins, the last town. The bridge was crossing the Nipigon River. And they had a ribbon cutting ceremony over a bridge that they had just built in order to expand the highway to make traffic flow easier from Ontario to the rest of Canada. And that was in October. Come January, when the real cold set in, it heaved by 18 inches, one end of it. And thank God nobody was killed, because I know driving a vehicle at 60 miles an hour, if it's a dark night, you're never, especially in a truck, you're never going to see that all of a sudden there's an 18-inch curb in front of you that goes across both lanes, and you're going to slam into it. So how somebody wasn't killed, I don't know. But it took them forever to get that repaired. So while on one hand I'm saying get government talking to each other, I'm reminded of incidents like that, and I agree with you, the government does nothing well and most things poorly.
Well, again, but you're saying that as a criticism. And I accept it as a legitimate criticism, but I also accept the fact and understand that government is inefficient. You're just trying to please too many people on too many issues at one time. It cannot be run efficiently.
All they have to do is please me.
You have to accept the fact that government is inefficient. And I'm not arguing when I say accept it. I'm not arguing for accepting the situation.
Yeah.
I'm just saying accept the fact that government is inefficient, and that, to me, is one of the strongest arguments for smaller government, less intrusive government, is because you can't do things really well with any organization that is that big, trying to do that many things for that many people at the same time. It just doesn't work.
They only have to please me. I'm the only one that matters. Anyway.
You and Bill Gates.
If I was in his class. Anyway, we wanted to get the cap and trade, but I think the Trinity West Trinity West Supreme Court case is more important. We'll get to the cap and trade story next week. The Supreme Court came down and tossed their Trinity West, is it university?
Yeah, Trinity Western University.
Right, okay, they're out in BC.
Correct.
And they have a legal school, and they were fighting to have their students to be accepted by the bar in all provinces.
Right. Well, the Law Society of British Columbia refused to grant accreditation in British Columbia for the Trinity Western University Law School. And just so people understand, Trinity Western University is I want to call it private. It's not as private as a private university in other countries, because in Canada, universities are not all entirely private.
They
even
get
the
some
private ones,
public funding. So
but insofar as private is concerned, it's as private as it could be in Canada and British Columbia. It's an evangelical university, and while it accepts people from all denominations, all backgrounds, etc., what Trinity Western does require is that students sign an agreement to live according to a particular code of conduct.
Right. One
of which is that they're not going to engage in premarital sex and relations, etc. So, unless they're married and marriage
to each other
between a man and a woman, one man and one woman to the exclusion of all others. So that is, not the exact wording, but that's one of the items in this code of conduct. And as a consequence of that, the BC government, or the BC
Bar
Law Society, which is the governing body of lawyers in British Columbia, refused to accredit them. So this case has been winding through the courts in Canada for some time, and it finally made its way to the Supreme Court. And was it this week or last week? Last week, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Law Society of British Columbia. In other words, they said, and it wasn't a unanimous decision, which was comforting to a certain degree. It was 7-2, I think, was the number. And but the majority ruled that the Law Society of British Columbia can indeed decline to accredit the Law Society of the Law School of Trinity Western because of this code of conduct. Very troubling ruling. It's what it really, I think, demonstrates is that you cannot, two things. The first is that you cannot rely on the courts in Canada anymore to really preserve and protect religious liberty. That itself is troubling. I think the other thing, and this probably deserves a more in-depth discussion, and maybe next week we could bring on some of the people who are more directly involved in this court proceeding,
sure,
in order to get a better handle on all of the details and the nuances and the ins and outs. But from my perspective, the emperor has no clothes. And in this case, what is the emperor? The emperor in this case, in my view, is the Pierre Trudeau Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I've never been a big fan of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms for a number of reasons, but it is what it is. It has been the law of the land for some time, and it's supposed to protect religious liberty. I think what this does is it demonstrates rather conclusively that the charter is a fraud. It's a complete fraud. It is only applied in those circumstances that the judges feel, because of the particular cultural zeitgeist that we're in,
right,
that it ought to apply. So there seems to be no real clear objective criteria that would allow judges to apply the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in order to protect religious liberty. And this is just an example of it. So, when people have said to me we should get rid of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, I've sort of poo-pooed it a little bit myself and said, well, I'm not a fan of it. I was around back in the days when they were debating bringing this in, and they did bring it in. And I didn't like it then. I thought there were significant issues with it that I think for the most part, I'm certainly not alone in criticizing it, but I think for the most part we've been proven right. But the real issue for me, quite apart from the detailed sort of nuts and bolts criticisms, etc., the micro criticisms, let's use that term, is ultimately bottom line that the Charter has proven to be a fraud.
All right. With that said, I want to spend the last couple of minutes on the show. We've got a few minutes left here before.
Don't forget, we have to reveal about the 45.
Well, let me do that right now. I have it right here because otherwise, you're right. I'll forget, and I promise I do it. Okay. I went to the appropriate website and found the appropriate information. When Columbia Records introduced the 33 and a third RPM long-playing album in 1948, they kept the hole in the center the same size. However, Columbia's arch-rival RCA was most annoyed at this new format. Rather than licensing Columbia's technology for their releases, RCA introduced their own new record, the 7-inch single that spun at 45 RPM and had a center hole that measured 1.5 inches in diameter. Why would they do something like that? Well, for two reasons. While the LP promised up to 22 minutes of uninterrupted music per side, RCA's crowed that their 45s could be stacked on special tall, fat spindles about 6 inches high that were exclusive to RCA-manufactured turntables. Once a side of 45 finished playing, and after 5 or 6 minutes, the tone arm moved away, long enough for the next record to drop down onto the platter. The tone arm then swung back into place. Music would continue with the ability to stack up to 10 45s on the RCA spindle. It was theoretically possible for the music to continue for a full hour without human intervention. That, in a nutshell, is why they did it. Now, as anyone who has paid attention to this stuff knows, that didn't last very long because they made adapters for these things, so they'd play on a 33 and a third platter. It didn't go the way RCA was thinking it was going to go, but that's why it had to do with licensing.
Right, and my recollection is that I could stack 4 or 5 LPs
that
also
because
after. They came up with the little mechanism that you could...
In the spindle, there was a little thumb that would stick out.
Yeah, you guys out there listening, you younger people out there listening, have no idea what we're talking about. Although turntables have made a comeback.
They have.
You can go into the store and find
have vinyl records.
Now that I got rid of all of my vinyl records, and we had a huge collection of really great albums.
Well, my sons, my older two boys, are into collecting vinyl records, things like Crystal Ball, things like Queen Day, Night of the Opera, Day of the Races, that kind of stuff. Anyway, that's the story behind that. Well, guess what, Joseph? That's 2 hours.
I know. It's a little over 2 hours. I think we've run over time just a teensy bit, but that's okay. We get to break the rules here anytime we want.
That's right. We do it frequently.
Okay, so we had a great time, and we're looking forward to catching you guys next week in the Combat Zone.
You bet. We'll see you all then.